Well, I think they have their uses, you know. I mean, to go to a conference and basically say why I'm not a feminist can be a nice way to open up a discussion on lots of things. Besides, I think that if you begin with this, well, I'm a feminist, there's not much room then to develop that alternative language, which for me personally derives from the Quran. And the Quran is not a feminist text. And I'm not going to be an apologist and read feminism into the Quran. But what I do argue is that the Quran provides a certain framework, an epistemological, ontological framework within which we can theorize radical sexual equality. Basically meaning if the Quran teaches that women and men are ontologically from the same self, same nafs, it completely changes the way in which Muslims in particular are used to thinking about women as having a secondary status, that she was taken from the man's rib. There is no such narrative in the Quran. And more importantly for me, the fact that the Quran doesn't masculinize God, doesn't engender God, doesn't patriarchalize God. In other words, we are told that God is uncreated and hence unlike anything. So God is beyond sex and gender. So that kind of, I call it an anti-patriarchal view of God. And if God cannot be patriarchalized, then I feel like the Quran, which is God's speech, also should not be patriarchalized.
But is this also an important distinction within the Abrahamic religions or the religions of the book between Islam at one side and Christianity at the other side? Because in many of your references to Christianity, that sex is connected often to the mortal sin, and Islam doesn't know a mortal sin.
No.
Could you elaborate on that?
Islam does not treat sex as sinful, but obviously there's a framework within which sex ought to occur, according to the Quran, which is within the framework of a nikah.
Of?
Nikah, between a woman and a man. And I guess we render it as marriage in this sense. So there's a framework within which, legitimate sex is supposed to occur. But the Quran acknowledges that it is joyful, it's not just for procreation, and there is no demonizing of the woman, for example, in the Quran for being a sexual being. In fact, there's this wonderful passage in the Quran which says that we have created you one from another so that you might dwell with each other in love and mercy. And the word that's used is actually sukoon. And according to Mustansir Mir, who's written this directory of Quranic terms, he says sukoon is something like sexual fulfillment, a kind of mental peace deriving from sexual fulfillment. So many people say Islam is a sex-positive religion. There is not that demonization of sex. But amongst Muslim tradition, there is a demonization of women as sexually tempting, as potentially corrupting, and that is the basis on which many Muslim societies then mandate the woman, being covered, because the idea is to guard the chastity of the male, who, heaven forbid, might be easily tempted. And so it's all the fault of the woman. Now, the fact is that in the scripture itself, there's absolutely nothing like that. And so for me, one of the more fascinating questions is, well, how have Muslims gotten so far away from the central, basic teachings of the Quran that they are almost a caricature of what the Quran is trying to teach them?